Welcome to my review of Castlevania for the NES. Yeah, this is a classic game that doesn't really need a review at this point. But this is another one that I did a tutorial of, so I'll link that in the description. So I've been reviewing a lot of the games that I already made tutorials for, just as a little extra companion video to the tutorial. And I already have all the footage, so, for my playthrough, so it makes it convenient to review these. Plus, this is always a good game to review. It's a great game, so it doesn't hurt to put out another review of the game. A lot of the games I've been doing have been more obscure, but occasionally I like to review some of these popular games. So yeah, in this game, this is the first real Castlevania game that a lot of people remember. There was a game called Vampire Killer on the MSX, which was a console in Japan, and with that version, it's very non-linear, meaning you have to get keys and backtrack. Visually, it looks a lot like this, but you have to backtrack, get keys, and I think you have no continues in that game, maybe one life to beat the game or something like that. It's way harder, and it's I didn't like the style as much because I like the more linear style. In that game, it's a lot of backtracking, not knowing where to go, things like that. This game is very straightforward. It's challenging, but it's a straight line pretty much. You don't have to you're not going to get lost in this game. So there was an arcade version of Castlevania called Haunted Castle that may have came before this or around the same time, and that's a very different game as well. So this is going to be the Castlevania game that most people who were around, at that time would remember. And it's the most known of those games. So this is kind of the game that started it all. And it's a very solid entry. You have your life bar. You can take several hits. Most enemies will do a few bars of damage to you when you get hit. Mainly you're going to die a lot of times from getting knocked into pits and things like that. Because there's a big knockback on this game. Like Ninja Gaiden for the NES, when you get hit, you get knocked back very far. So that's one of the dangers. One of the main dangers of the game. And there's a few bosses that are very very hard initially. They can be tough. The main roadblock for me in this game, since I was familiar with a lot of old games and beating lots of these old games, was the Reaper. That gave me trouble for a while. The Grim Reaper boss is one of the more difficult bosses of that time period. Very hard boss. I did a no damage run of it with just a basic cross weapon. And I show that here, I believe, in the review, and I also have that in my tutorial, so I try to break that down a little bit. But that's more of a practice thing, really. It's not like the kind of thing that is easy to explain, since the patterns are kind of random of the projectiles. But yeah, in this game, you're mostly just, you get whip upgrades as you progress. You can get them in candles by breaking candles, and you collect hearts. The hearts don't restore your life, but they give you more uses of your sub-weapon, which you collect sub-weapons, which are like an extra weapon you can use by pressing up and strike. So you got Holy Water, which locks a lot of the bosses in place and can pull bullshit. And, you got knives, crosses. The cross comes back to you. It's kind of like a boomerang. And there's a stopwatch that actually doesn't really work for most of the bosses, but can stop enemies and give you a chance to move past them or kill them. So, they give you a decent amount of sub-weapons. There's also numbers you can pick up, like 1, 2, 3, which will allow you to throw multiple sub-weapons out at once. So those are very good to get, if you can survive long enough to hold on to them. So you have a boss fight at the end of each stage. Occasionally you'll find a turkey in a wall or some shit like that, and that'll give you back, a decent amount of your health. Now, some of the bosses are quite easy to exploit, but there's a few tricky ones. For me, the hardest bosses were Frankenstein and the Hunchback, which are two bosses at once. And the Reaper was by far the hardest boss, much harder than even the final boss. And Dracula. Those are the three hardest bosses, I would say. Because Dracula has two forms, so you can't really mess up too much. But yeah, this game has some of the best music, in games. It's iconic music that's very well known. The gameplay is very tight. Great stage layouts. So even though this is by far the best Castlevania side-scrolling game, in this style, probably all the other Castlevania games, side-scrolling Castlevania games, are better than this one. But this was also the first. So, it was a very strong start for the series on the NES. But of course, I will be reviewing it based on how I think it holds up today. And, sometimes I will have a separate score for how it may have stood up at that time period, so I could do that too. But most of the time, I'm reviewing the game by how it would hold up today. So I'll take that into account, that there are, much better games in this style, but including games in this series, obviously. So yeah, this is one of the hardest boss fights to me, at least. I always had a lot of trouble trying to predict where the Fireball and the Hunchback are going to end up. So, it can be a little tricky. But it's a cool fight. Coming up soon, you'll see the Reaper area that I'm talking about. If you're not familiar with it, I show it here. So this is the whole checkpoint. This whole area and this new area is the checkpoint for the Grim Reaper. There is no checkpoint right before the boss or anything, and there's no healing items that you can pick up in this area. So whatever health you get to the Reaper with is what you have. I think there may be... it's possible there's a healing item before you go up this next flight of stairs, but we'll see in a moment. But I remember you don't get a healing item for a very long time in this area. Or at all. There may not be one. Maybe there's a turkey in here. Okay, yeah. Yeah, you get a healing item here, because this part's easy, but once you go up here, this is the long hallway before the Grim Reaper. And this is a tough area not to get hit in. You really don't want to get hit at all in this area like that, because the Reaper is extremely difficult if you take any damage. So you really want to avoid taking any damage here. But this is a hard part because you really don't want to get hit, and you got a lot of shit to manage. So it's it's probably the toughest section of the game, and the Reaper is the hardest boss of the game. So you got, a double fatality there with a very hard checkpoint, and, the boss is also the hardest. So now you'll see my no damage run on the Reaper, which is normally not how this fight's going to play out, because you see there's a lot of shit here to manage. This took me about 30 minutes of isolated safe state practice again and again until I was able to beat him. Just fighting the boss again and again, not doing the whole checkpoint prior. I already beat the game legit, so at this point I was just making a tutorial for the game and just trying to demonstrate sections and pull them off well. The Reaper was the only part that I really refined in the tutorial, because I thought that was the hardest part that could really use, a good demonstration of how it can be done with just, the regular sub-weapon. Not the Holy Water. If you have the Holy Water, you can lock the Reaper into place and just destroy him completely. Now this part I play kind of sloppy because this is the final checkpoint of the game. All you got to do is run up here and take some damage, and you'll be at the last checkpoint. The game is merciful to at least give you a checkpoint right at Dracula, so you can die as many times as you want. There's unlimited continues. So you can keep dying and continue right here until you beat Dracula and finish the game off. So that's cool. So you'll see the Dracula fight here, I show that. And that's also one of the hardest fights because, like I said, it goes on for a while. The Reaper is much harder than this, though. The Reaper is definitely the hardest single part of the game by far. And like I said, second to the Reaper is that hallway before the Reaper. That's the second hardest part in the game. So, you got those two back to back. So if you get past that roadblock in that stage, you should be able to beat the game. Most people who get stuck on this game seem to get stuck on the Reaper, and that was the case for me initially, but I went back to it much later and, determined to finally beat it. So check out the tutorial. I break everything down in there. But yeah, the final fight is pretty cool. It has two forms. And though this game is a little basic today by today's standards, and for other Castlevania games which have really improved on this formula a lot. Even Castlevania 3 for the NES was much, much better, much detailed, and more challenging overall, just a better game. Now the second game, Simon's Quest, I beat that recently on the channel using a guide because it's such an obscure and cryptic game, so I used a guide for that. Now you see with the Holy Water you can just lock the final boss in place, the final form. It's very easy with that trick. But yeah, the second one was such a different game. It has awesome music, but as a game I can't say I really like it too much, but it was fun to play through with a guide. But there's not much to the gameplay. The gameplay is super easy, and the only difficult part is that you don't know what the fuck you're supposed to do. That's the only challenge in the game. I mean, it was a cool concept at the time. Very mysterious game. I owned it. It was, and I really used to like it a lot, but I couldn't do shit in the game because it was so cryptic. Unless you had a guide, you probably weren't going to get very far. So this game, you can actually just learn it and beat it by playing it without having to look anything up. Though, don't get me wrong, I watch videos all the time, even on straightforward games. But yeah, overall, I would still say this game is a very good game that holds up, beyond even its nostalgia. I think it's a good, solid game. I give it a 7.5 just because I think that 7.5 out of 10 because I just think that there's games that have done this style way better, currently. You know what I mean? I still think this is a great game to go back to, and it would still hold up if it was released today. But now there's, even with these indie games, there's side-scrolling games that still blow this away, like the Bloodstained side-scrolling games, and too many to mention. But if you haven't checked this version out, this is where it started pretty much, so I recommend checking it out. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.